Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first conference, the final day today, looking at the future of funding for civil society in London. I'm James from London Funders, and it's great to see you all in the room virtually. You're part of a group of over 200 people who've joined us over these 3 days to look at the past, the present, and the future of funding for London's civil society. We hope you'll also join us online to help continue that conversation with the people who aren't able to be with us today using the hashtag Conference20. Shortly, I'm going to hand over to our chair for today's session, which is the fantastic Yolande Burgess from London Councils. But as people are arriving into the room today, we're going to do a quick poll to find out who's in the room and what your hopes and concerns are for the future, just to try and get us that framing for today's discussion. So you'll see a poll appearing on your screens now. The first question is asking you what kind of organisation you represent. You might be from the public sector, you might be from a trust or foundation, you might be one of our members who raises money and gives it out, such as lottery funds or local giving schemes, housing associations, corporates and others, reflecting that diversity of London Funders membership, with over 170 organisations coming together to invest in London civil society from across those different sectors. It's really helpful for us just to get a sense of who's in the room today as our panel prepare their remarks for you. The second question is asking you what approach your organisation is taking between now and March 2021 to its funding, which is a multiple choice question, but it's just, again, giving us a sense of where your approach to future funding is right now, whether you're intending to continue pausing to take new applications while you consider the future, whether you're looking at continuing to collaborate, partner, give more grants to your funders, to your grantees, sorry, and looking at where the future of that money is going to be. And then the third question there is asking you where you think funding will be focused between now and March 2021. So looking at this first bit, just to give our speakers a sense of what's on your minds as you're coming into the room today, whether it's about crisis during the winter months, whether it's about renewal and the future and that long term. So giving us a sense of what it is that you are focusing on today. So we're going to give you another 30 seconds just to complete that poll. It's really helpful for our panel just to get that sense of where you're coming from today as they prepare their remarks. But it's also really helpful for us at London Funders to get that sense of where your priorities are, so that we as an organisation can best support you in the coming months and in the years ahead to make sure that your funding is as effective as it can be for communities in London. So thank you for taking the time to complete that poll for us today. I'm just going to give you another 10 seconds to tick all the boxes that you want to tick, and then we'll share the results back with you so that you can see who else is in the room with you as well, because apologies, at these times we can't all get together and sit around those tables to have those chats, but through this you can get a sense of who else is part of the conversation this morning. So I'm going to end that polling, and so you can see who's in the room and what you are coming here today. So the biggest group today, just under half of the people in the room are for independent trusts and foundations, but a quarter of you are from our public sector members, reflecting local authorities and regional government. That's such a critical part of our funding infrastructure, and a good mix across housing association, corporates and others. Importantly, the majority of you there are looking to pivot your funding for the future, thinking about changing your priorities or your way of delivering grants. It's going to be really interesting to hear from our panel this morning about what their thoughts are about where the future ought to be directed. And finally, that opportunity to look at core and unrestricted funding coming out really strongly there, which again is a message we've heard from civil society, and I'm sure our panel will have some thoughts to share with you on that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to that fantastic panel, chaired by Yolande Burgess. Yolande.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final day of London Funders Conference 2020. We've had two brilliant sessions yesterday and the day before, and today is no exception. We've got an amazing panel with us. I'm just going to very quickly introduce who's on our panel this morning. So we have Miatta Fahnbulleh. Miatta is the Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation. She has a wealth of experience in developing and delivering policy to empower communities and change people's lives. She's also been at the forefront of generating new ideas on reshaping our economy inside government and out. Miatta will be followed by Ben Rogers. Ben's an urbanist, researcher, writer and speaker, and he has a particular interest in urban life, citizenship, public service reform and the built environment. He founded the Centre for London in 2011 and has written reports on charitable giving, delivering London's large sites and challenges facing the West End. Cassie Robinson is also on our panel. Cassie is the senior head of the UK portfolio for the National Lottery Community Fund. Her portfolio includes the Emerging Futures Fund, the Climate Action Fund, the Digital Fund, and Exploring New Approaches. She's also a co-founder of the Point People, a fellow at the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL, and a fellow at the Lieberhuhn Centre for the Future of Intelligence at Cambridge University. And we're delighted to welcome onto our panel Debbie Weeks-Bernard. Debbie became Deputy Mayor for Social Integration, Social Mobility and Community Engagement in November 2018. Debbie works to improve Londoners' lives chances and to boost social integration and community voice across the Mayor's programme. She leads importantly on the promotion of equalities and active citizenship across London and makes sure City Hall actively seeks to tackle poverty for London across all groups. Just as a quick reminder in terms of our focus for the panel this morning, our panellists will be looking ahead to the long term. They'll be reflecting on what lies beyond the crisis and discussing what opportunities and challenges our city and communities may encounter in the years to come. We know that work is taking place to ensure we recover from the crisis, but we also know that we need to go far beyond recovery, because what we had before didn't serve all the people of London, and some of it perpetuated inequity and injustice across our city. And we live in one of the most diverse cities on the planet. So this morning, in the spirit of optimism, transformation and renewal, our speakers are going to elaborate on their hopes and aspirations about what we can achieve when we emerge from the crisis, and hopefully paint a picture of a better and fairer London. Just a couple of quick reminders to our great delegates. There will be time for questions to the panel at the end, so please do start posting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You'll also notice that you'll be able to upvote questions. So if you spot a question and think, oh, I've got a similar question, what you can do is simply upvote it and it'll pop to the top of the pile. Please also use the chat box to say hi to each other, and it'll be great if you can post resources, anything that you think will be interest to the delegates and panelists. And please obviously join the conversation using social media through the hashtag Camference20. So without further ado, if I can ask our first speaker, Miatta Fahnbulleh, to share her reflections and thoughts with our delegates. Thank you, Miatta.
Brilliant. Good morning. I'm absolutely delighted to be joining you all this morning. So we sort of are having this conversation in the midst of a pandemic that, yes, is a public health crisis first and foremost, but that we all know is being accompanied by an unprecedented economic crisis. We had the early warning signs from the government's watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, earlier in the year, that showed that we were looking at about a 12% drop in GDP this year, so the sharpest annual contraction in GDP for 300 years. An estimated 3 million unemployed by this Christmas, 3.5 million going into next year, taking us to levels of unemployment that we haven't seen since the 1980s. And all of this was before the onset of the second wave, which is going to make this prognosis all the more challenging. So I don't think any of us are in any doubt that we have entered an economic crisis that will be absolutely profound. But it's a crisis that is shining a huge spotlight on deep-seated structural problems with the economy that were there anyway, like the fact that living standards had pretty much stagnated since 2008. So, at the start of this pandemic, we went into it with living standards no higher than they were well over a decade ago, which is absolutely unprecedented. We had 14.5 million people across the country living in poverty. We had 1.3 kids living in poverty. So it has meant that many families are going into this pandemic with very little cushion to weather the storm, eating paycheck from paycheck, eating hand from mouth, paycheck to paycheck. I think it's also shining a huge spotlight on how denuded our social security and social protections have become. whether that's underinvestment in vital public services like health and care that we absolutely need in moments like this, or whether it is the inadequacy of our social security system, where employment support as a proportion of income is the lowest that it's been since the welfare state was created, and we are amongst the lowest in the OECD countries. And then for me, I think the final thing is, it's shining a huge spotlight on the cost, the untold suffering of not responding and not preparing for these types of natural crisis, despite the warnings of the scientists. And I think the parallel to climate change and the ecological crisis is there and stark for all of us to see. But I think the thing, and this is where the hope, the note of optimism comes in here, I think the thing that has really struck me is how quickly this has crystallized in the public mood and how quickly the debate is shifting. The vulnerabilities that I think have been exposed by this pandemic are already forging a new consensus for the need for change. The polling shows that across the country, in the capital, there is a really strong appetite not to revert back to business as usual when we come out of this. And there is a sense that we've got to build something better coming out of this pandemic. And, across the political spectrum, this sentiment is being played out. The Prime Minister himself is saying that we must build back better. And I think he's saying this because he's reflecting the mood in the country. So the political space has suddenly opened up for us to forge a new consensus on the need to build a fairer and more sustainable economy coming out of this. And I think the fact that the government is being forced to tear up the old rulebook on what is and isn't possible, as it's having to respond to the crisis, is challenging the mainstream and making ideas that were once viewed as either too radical or too risky suddenly acceptable. So I think the tides are shifting, and there is an opportunity for us to forge a consensus on the need for change, but critically also the opportunity for us to adopt bold, ambitious ideas for delivering this change. But I'm really conscious that this opportunity is a fragile one. And my biggest fear is that we don't lock in this sentiment in the country, we don't lock in this mood in the country and translating into meaningful change, and that the moment then passes and other pressures and other priorities take over, and that we have lots of well-meaning voices calling for us to build back better, but that we do this in a fragmented way, which means that we are not greater than the sum of our parts, and we don't create a drumbeat for the sort of change that we need to see. And, I think it's clear that the scale, the nature of the sort of change that we need to come out of this crisis and to build back better requires us to build a broad coalition, which will include national voices with their power and their influence, as well as grassroots voices who bring the authenticity and the power of lived experience. And we need to try and bring this together into a powerful coalition that can win this change. And this is the logic behind the work that organizations like myself, the New Economic Foundation, and others are trying to do, to try to see whether we can bring together lots of voices to build a powerful coalition with a coherent and focused response to the crisis that says collectively, if we are serious about building better, and I believe that everyone holds that aspiration, well, that means, first and foremost, a new social settlement coming out of this that seeks to enshrine protections for everyone through proper social security safety net, as well as access to well-funded health, care, and quality housing. It means action to reduce inequality between people and places. And in the capital, we have the story of huge prosperity and then acute deprivation, and that cannot be right. And part of this will mean creating well-paid, decent, secure jobs across the backdrop of increasing unemployment. And then finally, it means doing whatever it takes to prepare in a way that we did not prepare for this pandemic, for the bigger crisis, which is upon us, which is coming, of climate change. And for me, this third plank is really, really critical as we think about how we come out of this. Because for those of us that have been advocating for bold, ambitious, radical change in response to the climate crisis, we've long said that this crisis is unprecedented in both its scale and impact, and it will change everything. But in truth, I think this has always been quite hard for people to imagine or to conceptualize. But we are now in a crisis that is changing everything, in a crisis that is making us do things that few of us would have imagined was possible but a year ago, and that is absolutely unprecedented in scale. And this is just a taster of what it will feel like when we are in the eye of the storm of the climate crisis if we do not act. So we've got to use this sense of urgency in order to galvanize around the need for change. And that's not just about galvanizing people around the ambition to build back better. It's not just about a narrative that captures the public moods and resonates across the country. It also means bold, common sense ideas that people can rally around. And then building these alliances across organizations and movements to push for these as demands, using the different advocacy and the different campaigning skills of our partners in order to win that change. And, and if we can pull this off, and it is a big if, but if we can pull this off, we have the chance of winning the sort of big systemic change that we need in order to be able to tackle long-standing economic and environmental challenges. Now, I don't, and this is where I'll end, I don't pretend that any of this is easy. Getting partners to have a shared aim across organizational boundaries to coalesce around is incredibly hard. Trying to cut across natural political divides and biases to forge a new consensus is incredibly hard. Trying to shift ingrained ways of doing things is hard. But I always say, if not now, then when? Like, if not in response to the biggest crisis that we are facing for generations, that is shaking our foundations to the core, then when? So we've got to try and give this our best shot and see where it lands. And there is an absolutely critical role for you to play as funders. Not just to be champions and advocates of this sentiment to build back better, as important as that is, not just to fund individual organizations and initiatives that will be doing vital work as part of both the emergency response and as part of the recovery, but to fund differently, to fund in ways that facilitates and encourages the sort of collaboration, the sort of coalition building that we need if we are to win this change. And that means flexible, unrestricted funding that can be spent across organizational boundaries to deliver programs of activities by coalition of partners to win the recovery. And if we can do this, we have a chance of turning this sentiment to build back better into reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miatta. Some really powerful messages there, particularly around being bold and being ambitious, and the need for us to really grasp a painful moment in time and turn it to our advantage. Thank you so much, Miatta. I'd now like to hand over to Ben Rogers. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts and reflections, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you. It's never easy following Miatta. That was a brilliant. So now everyone is seeing my screen. That's not right. Hang on a second. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on here. Right, here we go. Right, can you all see that?
We can see your screen, Ben.
Can you see that? Sorry, can you see that? You can see the presentation?
Yes.
Great, okay. Right, so I'm Ben Rogers. I'm founding director of Centre for London. For those of you that don't know us, we are London's think tank. We're a charity, and we use our research and events and convening and influencing power to tackle London's big strategic challenges. And I was really pleased to be asked to talk about the future today, because we are in the middle of a sort of once in a generation strategic review of London, which is being supported by a sort of range of London organisations, including City of London, the Mayor of London, London councils, City Bridge Trust, and others. And we're looking 30 years ahead, so up to London 2050, but with a sort of series of timeframes, thinking about recovery, thinking about carbon neutrality in 10 years' time, and then thinking sort of beyond that. And our model is very much, we look back 30 years as well, particularly to the London World City Report in 1991, which was commissioned by the forerunner of London councils and City of London and others. and which was really influential. And as I say, it's a bit of a sort of paradigm, I think, for what we want to do. So you will remember back, or you won't remember because many of you are probably very young, but back in 1991, London was very much in the doldrums. Its manufacturing industries had pretty much collapsed. The docks had been decimated, population had fallen. Thatcher had abolished the GLC. And London really lacked a sort of sense of where it was going. As I say, a group of people came together, a group of organizations came together and commissioned research and came up with a sort of new strategy for London. And it was premised on an understanding that the world was changing very fast. We were moving from a industrial to a knowledge and service economy. The world was globalizing. London was competing against other global cities on an international stage. And it made a series of recommendations, including creating a pan-London system of government, investing in culture, in livability, in public transport, creating an overseas promotion agency for London and other things, which really did sort of set the roadmap for London for the next sort of 20 years or so, and became a sort of dominant paradigm for London, if you like. And it created a sort of coalition of people who sort of could come behind it. But our sort of premise is that narrative really has run out of steam, doesn't feel any longer sort of fit for purpose, and we need a new vision, a new roadmap for London. So that is what we're trying to do. It's very much a sort of collective effort, working with organizations like those of you represented this event today, amongst many others. It falls into three programs, three phases. So there's a sort of research phase, and there's a sort of convening and engagement phase, and then an influencing phase. So we're now moving from the research phase into the engagement phase. So we published a report last month, setting out the findings of sort of the research, the benchmarking, the sort of the historical research we did, and so on. I'm just going to talk a bit about that now. So what is the story of London over the last 30 years? Obviously, the population took off. It's been growing at about 100,000 people a year. And against that background, it's not surprising that London's economy grew very fast and grew much faster than the economy of the rest of the country. We saw a big shift in the nature of London's economy from industrial jobs. So that's the sort of bottom pale blue line on the chart on the bottom left, and a big increase in service jobs. London is known as a business centre, a banking centre, and those jobs certainly increased, but so did work in higher education, in culture and the creative industries, and in the hospitality sector. And London became more productive because we became more skilled, we were more cosmopolitan. That productivity has actually sort of fallen back to sort of national standards after the Great Recession of 2008 and 9. But before then, we were sort of made big grounds, not just the number of people working in London, but how productive, how they were, how creative, how efficient. London historically had always had high employment. So one of the success stories of the last sort of 30 years in a way is the way in which unemployment has fallen in London. We now have the same, this is before, of course, the pandemic, the same historically low unemployment rates of the rest of the country, and a huge growth in London's workforce. Yes, we've become a service economy, but as the chart on the bottom left shows, huge range in jobs, and some very, very well-paid jobs at the top, particularly in sort of high knowledge sectors, and then a lot of low-paid, much more precarious jobs, particularly in the sort of hospitality sectors and the sort of sectors which like to serve the high-paying Londoners who are doing really well out of London as a sort of world city. One result of this has been a big rise in working poverty. So sort of the profile of poverty in London has really changed. The actual headline numbers have remained very, very stubborn, and they're much higher than elsewhere in the country. Rule of thumb, about a quarter of children across the UK grow up in poverty, but about a third of children in London do. But a big shift from particularly over the last 20 years, from poverty being not just an inner London phenomenon, but an outer London phenomenon, much more identified with people in the rental sector and much more identified with people in work. Development has been very, very uneven, very sort of patchy, if you like. So we always talk about London as a polycentric city. I mean, mayors always talk about wanting London to be a polycentric city, but actually it's remained very much a sort of monocentric city, with particularly most of the economic activity becoming, if anything, more concentrated in the central activity zone and Canary Wharf, and then there's a few high density developments elsewhere. We have really struggled, against the background of a very, very fast growing population, to meet our housing targets. There's been very few years we've actually done it, and then the latest housing need analysis shows a big jump in the number of houses that we need to build, and so we're even further off target. And as a result, a big increase in overcrowding, some increase in homelessness, and so on. And as I say, a big move of families from owning homes into renting them, and the difficulty of getting a mortgage has just grown. Income inequality, interestingly, hasn't grown. I mean, I think that's perhaps also surprise some people who are listening. The general view is that it must have done, but it remains much higher in London than elsewhere, particularly after housing costs. I mean, housing are the sort of single biggest challenge in the city, but a big increase in wealth inequality, again, I think very bound up in housing, that the way in which people are lucky enough to own a home has seen their wealth increase at the expense of those that don't. And I've mentioned overcrowding already. Climate change. So I don't think we've been doing well on that at all. If you the top left-hand chart does show that we have been, as a country, made big progress in putting our power supplies onto a sustainable footing through the increase in wind energy and tidal. But if we look at the bottom left-hand slide, which looks at the most emitting sectors in London, the one on the furthest left, the highest one, is non-residential electricity. Well, we can tackle that because, as I say, we're making big progress in greening our electricity supplies. I think the ones that should really concern us are the next two or three, so residential gas, and road transport, particularly, where we're not making the progress that we need to make, and electrifying our power, greening our power sources won't do anything to help those. So we really just simply got to retrofit our homes and get out of our cars. And the chart on the right just shows you the scale of the installation programs that we've been doing up until now, and then the scale of the installation programs that we'll need if we are to be on track to meet our climate change targets. So sort of absolutely sort of transformational scale of intervention is needed. Enter COVID. I mean, I think you all know the story about COVID. London has had a high mortality rate, largely just because of the sort of profile of the people that live and work in London. Many poorer people, health conditions, bad housing, and so on. Contrary perhaps to popular understanding, we shut down very dramatically in London compared to other world cities. Fewer of us were going to work, more of us were staying at home, and I think there's no doubt that COVID has further polarized inequality in London, and this sort of very familiar phenomenon of sort of knowledge workers, high-paid knowledge workers, actually finding they could work from home quite effectively, and many of them rather enjoying it. And then people who were sort of serving those in restaurants, hotels, or wherever, really suffering. Well, this is, I'm not going to talk about the third one, this is a bit out of date.
And it's just a gentleman 1 minute warning.
Okay, very good. So I think, so I think London finds itself as sort of, it was already, I think, in a bit of an existential crisis before the pandemic. It's the pandemic has really sort of accentuated that. We're at a crossroads in a storm. And we've got a government that seems also very, very intent, as far as I can see, on sort of rolling back the devolution agenda that I think is so absolutely important to London. London remains, by international standards, a very, very underpowered system of government. And mayors want under powers that New York, Tokyo, Paris have. And we're now seeing sort of rolling back of that if you look at what the government is doing with TfL. London, since Brexit, has moved down international rankings. So I'm going to just to say 3 more slides. We've been beginning to look forward as well as looking back. So thinking about what are the big global forces that will change London, or which we will have to sort of grapple with over the next 30 years. They're listed here. And then doing some scenarios, so just thinking about sort of possible ways in which London could develop, and trying to explore some of the sort of what that would mean for trade-offs, how you would, what are the sort of totemic policies you need to adopt, and where are the sort of synergies between them. And that is the project. So as I say, we are now entering on a phase of intensive engagement. We were planning to do this face-to-face. We're not. Instead, we're investing quite a lot of resource into a sort of new deliberative digital tool. We would love to bring this out to your organizations and to the organizations that you fund. We really want London Civil Society to be at the heart of this. I think there's been a sort of huge buy-in and support from the public sector. We've got a lot of senior business leaders. We've got senior civil society leaders sort of engaged. We really want to create something which sort of changes the narrative for London and ends up with a sort of new vision behind which we can get as a city. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ben. There's some really rich information there. I'm also struck by the fact that a lot of that information has been around for quite a long time. So it kind of begs the question, we've known the problem, so let's go and find the solution. Simple, but effective. Thank you so much, Ben. Cassie, welcome to the panel. It'll be lovely to hear your reflections and thoughts from the National Lottery Community Fund. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me here. My Wi-Fi is actually playing up a little bit, so I might actually turn my camera off when I've just sort of done the first few minutes of hello. Before I sort of start this, I always think it's important, when sort of talking about the future, just first, I really want to acknowledge, the huge loss of human life that we have experienced during this time, and also to acknowledge kind of future generations, as the previous 2 speakers have spoken about. This is a time where so much change is also possible, and I think it's just really important to have those future generations in our mind as well. And lastly, I just also wanted to acknowledge that there's people in this group who are my colleagues, Alan and Helen, I think, are here, who, I feel a bit fraudulent because they, in some ways, have been much more focused on the crisis response than I have been in the UK portfolio. And I'm very glad this week that the England Directorate are having a slow week, because they really deserve it. So I just wanted to sort of show my face, and I am actually now going to switch my camera off, so nice to see you all. So, I mean, I was going to just reflect firstly just on some of the organisational lessons learned, but I'm not going to spend too much time on them. I think for all of us as funders, we have had to work in new and different ways. And I think certainly at the National Lottery Community Fund, we had to figure out quite quickly, like what is and isn't essential. But I think especially coming into this second wave, we are also experiencing like the loss of things in a way that we weren't before. I think the idea that we're not getting creative space to come together, or those kind of serendipitous moments, which I think actually play into this idea of how do we like think about the future and design for the future. And also just to acknowledge that I think for all of us here, probably we've all been working ridiculously long hours, and the sort of the toll of that over time. I think, yeah, we all need to acknowledge that, and the sort of well-being of our teams, of our staff. And I wasn't going to talk too much about sort of what we've learned from our grantees, because I feel like there are probably some common themes that we're all perhaps familiar with by now, which are still very important, around equity and being proactive in how we address that, around digital, around organisations needing resource to be able to adapt, and to consider their futures. And also a lot of, we're hearing a lot about the mental health of staff in the organisations that we fund. And I would just say, one thing that we've got coming up, which I hope will be a really important resource for the whole, for sort of the whole sector, is a learning hub, which is being launched, I think, this week or next, which is going to have like all of our grantees, potentially up to 12,000 if they all choose to use it, will be able to use this learning hub that's being developed by Ipsos Mori and Tavistock, and some other partners, and I think that has the potential to be a really good resource for civil society going forward. I think some personal reflections from me before I go into the future. I think I've been really struck by and would ask of people going forward how we are better at holding plural views and recognise the need for like multiple approaches. I think in a time where there's so much division and so many polarities, we tend to all go, it all needs to be done in this way, or it all needs to be done in that way. And actually we need lived experience, we need learned experience, we need practice experience, we need participatory grant making, and we need strategic funding. We need all of those things. And I think we sometimes are in danger of, running with one. And I suppose I've found it very difficult in the last 6 months not having enough spaces to talk publicly about the trade-offs that we've had to make and that we will continue having to make. On the one hand, we weren't doing things quickly or urgently enough. And then when we weren't able to do it in a very equitable way. If we had spoken about the climate crisis and our climate action fund with as much visibility as we had with our emergency funding, how would that have landed? So just this, there are trade-offs all of the time. And I think we all in this space, it would be interesting how we can talk about those more publicly. So in terms of the future, thinking about the future, I've got about 6 sort of themes here. I think the first one is all about technology and digital, actually, and kind of how this kind of rush online might play out over time. So the pandemic has exposed how intertwined the internet has become with our social fabric. And while civil society has always had to adapt to the way technology has changed industry and society and respond to the new behaviours and expectations that such changes can bring, there are few parallels to the sheer scale and pace of change we're experiencing now and the dilemmas that this is going to create for civil society. And within that, we have a role in sort of stopping new technologies creating more inequality and exacerbating existing ones, especially in a pandemic world where a new class of the tech left behind is being created and people are overwhelmed by the power and potential of the changes that new technologies bring. And these changes will get faster rather than slower. So civil society is we are well placed to equip communities with greater understanding, but we need to move beyond the sort of reductive and quite simplistic idea that digital skills are all that is needed in a digital society. Because while skills are helpful in terms of using new technologies, skills don't shape the future. And to shape the future, communities need to understand how technologies work and the implications of how we use them. This is what's needed to move people away from just being consumers of technology to producers and governors of technology. And that's a first step towards power and agency. And it will help communities respond to the effects of technology on local economies, from automation on jobs to local authorities procuring digital technologies problematically, or online shopping impacts on the high street. And that there's another challenge for us to consider around technology, which is who's going to own our infrastructure. So what does it mean for civil society to rely on privately owned platforms that exist to generate advertising revenue rather than improve quality of life or access to social justice. So most of the platforms like WhatsApp or Zoom or Google Meet are currently free at the point of use, but they're run by US-based companies who have no commitment to ongoing continuity of service. So there's long-term insecurity for communities that are dependent on a single piece of technology to bring them together. And linked to that, you know, how is social infrastructure going to keep up? As everyday life becomes more screen-based and automated, there's a need for new and different thinking about the support structures we need as individuals and the shared amenities that communities need to thrive and survive. Social infrastructure needs refreshing and reinvigorating for data-driven times. And then I'm going to talk a bit about kind of foresight and futures. So in reality, civil society and the social sector are horizon scanning all of the time. But the intelligence in civil society and in communities is often siloed and only called upon when things have already gone wrong. In addition, the information collected and understood by civil society is often not translated into the kinds of data that are used to power big technology projects. The intelligence of frontline workers or local community groups is not captured in ways that easily fill data stores or inform algorithms. This unique insight into how life is really lived and what kind of society people want is an important resource to draw upon in times of change. So how could we surface and make use of the intelligence in communities collectively, and what kinds of tools and methods can support this kind of sense making to assert the local and the communal as an important shaper of the world we live in? And most importantly, what is needed to move civil society from having a downstream role as a customer of technology and a defender of digital rights to having an upstream role as a shaper of new technologies. And we've also recently set up the Emerging Futures Fund, which was a fund that has been asking communities at this time to inquire about the future.
Cassie, just a gentle 1 minute warning.
Okay, to think about what the new narratives are that are needed or how they can imagine alternatives. And I think it's important for all of us as funders to think about who's getting to shape the future, and to also be honest about what communities don't know they don't know. And that's why trying to build the capacity in communities to imagine alternatives is important. And you can't rely on responsive funding and the data from that to do that kind of foresight work. And so I'll finish. I haven't got through it all, but that's okay. I'll finish on actually fittingly on the need to resource organisations to also close down. And there are some different initiatives starting to happen around what is the role of funders in helping organisations to do that compassionately and intelligently. And that's not just in response to the crisis, but actually if we're thinking about systemic change, if we're thinking about the cycle of renewal and composting, then funders have a role to play in making that possible to be done in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cassie. Some really interesting thoughts there to reflect on. I was very struck by your comment around loss. And certainly I think about the fact that we're having a conference this year and reflect on the fact that as human beings, we're hardwired to connect, and we're learning to connect in a different way. And we really do need to think about the long-term consequences of that. But also some really powerful messages there for funders as well. Thank you very much, Cassie. Can I just remind you before we hand over to our final panelist, Debbie, that please do keep your questions coming. If you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, that will be absolutely fantastic. And I'm delighted to welcome our final panelist, Debbie Weeks-Bernard. Thank you, Debbie.
Thanks so much, Yolande, thanks for the invitation to come and speak at this really important event this morning. It's always really hard to go last, particularly as I was sitting here nodding vigorously at literally everything that the previous three panelists were saying, and also thinking, gosh, they're not leaving me with very much that I can actually add and say. But I'm going to try my best to add to the points that they've raised already. I'm going to reflect as briefly as I can, because I recognise that I've got a time limit here, and I'm known to go on and go on beyond the time limits that I'm often given. I'm going to try to speak quite briefly about what I think are the things that we certainly learned in our response to the pandemic at City Hall. What I think are some of the challenges that are outstanding, and also to use both of these things to point to what I think are the things that we can be thinking about for the future in our horizon scanning activities. So the things that I think that we definitely learned, there were a huge range of things that we learned during the development of this pandemic, but there's two things that I'd like to reflect on initially. The first was the power and importance of collaboration to us doing an effective response to what we were all faced with, and also the importance of data, and also recognizing not just how important data is, but also accepting, understanding and acknowledging the different types of data that it was necessary for us to draw on. So I'm sort of quite heartened to hear what Cassie was saying just previously about the importance of using different types of data to help us to think about what our future response needs to be. On collaboration, it was clear at the very start of this pandemic that the way in which we were going to best tackle supporting, reaching out for, but also protecting Londoners was to do so in concert with a range of other partners. This was not something that City Hall, the GLA, the Mayor's Office could do alone. Our response was led by working very closely with London councils, with all of the London boroughs, with the NHS, with civil society partners, both big and small organisations, but also with funders. And one of the most instantaneous things that we were able to do, working in conjunction with London funders, was the development of the London Community Response pooled funding pot, which we contributed to, which I know I think up to 60 funders also contributed to. And this was how collaboration was incredibly important to enabling us to properly respond to what we could see were increasing levels of demand being made of a range of different, often quite small grassroots organisations, providing the reach into communities who themselves were continuing to work and to move around the capital, even once lockdown had been imposed, largely because of the ways in which those communities are not evenly distributed across our labour market. So those working in insecure, often exploitative areas of work, low paid, and for whom working at home was simply not an option. And so that collaborative work with funders, as well as the range of other partners that I've mentioned, enabled us to develop a funding response to that increased demand of those grassroots organisations who needed to be there to provide the support, as well as the information translated often in a variety of different community languages, which we know was lacking at the start. And to be quite frank, during the pandemic, to groups who needed to have public health messaging transmitted to them in a way that they understood and would be able to respond to. So collaboration was incredibly important to our response. But then also so was data, because through that collaboration, we were able to collect from many of the organisations who were funded through that pot, and those who applied to be funded through that pot, information about what beneficiaries were asking them to support them with. The community response survey that was developed with up to 300 organisations enabled us to find out on a weekly basis what it was that people were needing support with. And from week to week, this would often change. The priorities could be mental health at one point, could be food insecurity at another, could be responding to isolation. And this enabled us to get access to data, which in the middle of the pandemic, we did not have. And this leads me to the issue of data. Prior to the pandemic, many of us who are on this call, many of the speakers who've spoken previously, we knew that there were already persistent inequalities at work for many communities in our city. Ben's already alluded to the fact that we do have some of the highest rates of child poverty in the whole of the country, and there are boroughs within our city in which the child poverty rate is over 50%. We also knew with the data that we were collecting that food insecurity was also incredibly high in London, and we were able to develop measurements of regional levels of food insecurity, which hadn't been done before. So we knew before we went into the pandemic that there were far too many people already living in London in food insecurity. And we also knew prior to the pandemic that there were far too many individuals who were working in low pay. And what the pandemic clearly illustrated and exacerbated were those inequalities. And we discovered that the pressure placed on those providing food aid to many of those groups of individuals was intense. In the early days of the pandemic hitting, before government responses financial packages were able to be announced and established, many of the sectors which were forced to close meant that there were lots of individuals who were made redundant, finding themselves for the very first time having to make claims for universal credit, and indeed finding themselves for the very first time having to be referred to a food bank. And so even though we had those bits of really important data, quite quickly as we went into the pandemic, some of that data then became out of date because the numbers of those seeking support increased exponentially. And that's why that civil society data that we were able to access in the early days was so important. The challenges that I think that we continue to have relate to inequality. And I think inequality will be one of our greatest challenges going forward, because we know that COVID exposed and widened some of those inequalities. And so we know that COVID wasn't the great leveler. We know that you were disproportionately more likely to be infected with coronavirus if you came from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic background, and that the rates were around 2 times as likely, twice as likely for Black Londoners, and nearly twice as likely for Pakistani and Bangladeshi Londoners, and that this reflected where people worked, as well as huge structural barriers that people were experiencing before then. What it's necessary for us to do, and I think that this will inform what our future response will be, is that we have to tackle those structural drivers of inequality. It is no accident that during this pandemic, whilst many families were reeling from loss of life as well as loss of livelihood, particularly those from some of those minority ethnic and migrant backgrounds that I've described already, it was no surprise that the Black Lives Matter global protests impacted on in such a way, not just here in London, but across the UK and indeed across the world, because we were exposing at that point huge structural inequalities which were being experienced by particular groups of people. And so taking all of that in consideration, it's clear that inequality is going to be something that we really need to be incredibly focused on and alive to. So if we think about what the future is likely to be, I think there's a couple of things to highlight. We're in the middle of our second wave. Prior to many of the restrictions that have been announced by government over the past few weeks, we're thinking about what London's economic and social recovery could look like. We realised that we can't talk about recovery without also recognising that the way in which this pandemic is impacting upon individuals means that we have to think about recovery and response at the same time, which means that we can have really ambitious views about what it is that we want to see, the type of London that we want to see, the type of society that we want to see for individuals, whilst recognizing that we will need to continuously be in response mode until we are able to get on top of what COVID-19 is presenting for many people. So the recovery work that we are thinking about is ostensibly about us trying to reimagine our city, having a city in which occupational segregation is no longer a driver of inequality for particular groups of individuals. It's no surprise that there are particular groups of people who experience COVID in this way because of the types of jobs that they were working in. And we know that Black and brown individuals in this city are not evenly distributed in London's labour market. And so a future city for us would be one in which you do not find certain groups of individuals more likely to be working in some of those lowest paid jobs, and indeed some of those jobs that put them at direct risk of contracting any kind of virus that should present itself because of the types of work that they are involved in.
Debbie, just a gentle 1 minute warning.
Okay, right, I'm going to be really quick. So the other thing that I think is also incredibly important is to recognize that a lot of the solutions to many of the situations in which we find ourselves do need to be community-led. I mentioned civil society data and how important it was to us at the initial stages where there was a gap in information. We recognise that the way in which to really properly have a recovery for London is to have one in which we enable community-led solutions to many of those many of the difficulties and barriers and challenges that people face to be supported. That we continue to have funding models, much in the same way as both Miatta and Ben described, but funding models which enable collaboration to continue. We will be facing an economic crisis, that is clear. And what we will need to be able to do is to group together with as many funders as possible to be able to continue to fund some of the work that we know is incredibly important. And we also need to ensure that we are on top of what we can see as being a clear mental health crisis on the horizon. And so using community-led solutions to that crisis, but also making sure that we improve and increase access for Black, Asian and minority ethnic Londoners and those on low incomes to be able to access the support that they need, which they often feel that they are barred from or that they excluded from. So I've not had an opportunity to go through my very long list of things that I think we do need to be mindful of when thinking about the future, but ultimately recognizing that those who have lived experience of a set of situations are often the very best ones to know what are the best ways to try to remove those barriers which have been preventing them from thriving and succeeding. And that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and apologies to all the panelists who I had to gently remind to come to a close, because obviously we do want to give our delegates the opportunity to ask questions. I think Debbie gave us some stark reminders there about the fact that COVID didn't create the inequalities that we're seeing now. They were already there. And unfortunately, it highlighted some of the ones that are just baked in. And certainly the solutions, and as Debbie has said, and all of our panelists have said, that those solutions need to be community-led. And how we do that will require all of us to change how we work. Some really interesting reflections and thoughts from the panelists there. Thank you very much. So if we now move over to the Q&A, we have plenty of questions here. So our upvoting has worked. And the question that many of our delegates would like the panelists to reflect on are, do you think the government's pledge to build back better is sincere, considering the vote on free school meals yesterday? What can funders and civil society do to hold the government to account on issues like this and influence what better looks like? And if I could come to Miatta first on that, thank you.
Very good question. I do think it's sincere insofar as I think the politics demands it. I think whether it's the politics of winning the next election, I think whether it's the politics of navigating through this pandemic and holding the country together, I think they do want to build back better. I however, think that at the moment they're being a bit short-termist. And so, if you think about the support measures that the government had put in place at the start of the pandemic, and they're rolling a lot of that back, partly because, there's a part of them that's worried about the story about the public finances. And I think the arguments that we need to make, and I'll come on to the role of civil society, is that the way that we respond to the emergency, the way that we respond to the here and now will lay the foundations for us to build back better. And if, for example, we allow ourselves to go through a winter in which there are huge job losses, in which we have families that are completely hammered by this, it completely constrains our ability to build something better on the other side of this. So what they do now matters for the long-term recovery. And I think the more that that argument is made, the better. And in the end, for me, the cost of not acting, the cost of allowing entrenched poverty, inequality, the cost of allowing rising unemployment will far outweigh the cost of support in the short term. And I think the thing that civil society can do really powerfully is to speak with one voice. And I think there are two parts of that. It's easy to use the words build back better. It's easy to talk in generic terms about an ambition. And I think the more that we are able to say it means this, and collectively say new social settlement, inequality, climate change over and over again, and say it in a united voice, it becomes very hard for the government to say one thing and then not do another thing. And then I think the other thing is we need clear tests. So, for me, there was a test this winter that is about jobs and income. You've got to be able to protect that if you are serious about building better. And the more that we say that collectively, and the more that actually we give space and voices to those at the sharp end with lived experience, that the power and the authenticity of their voices is a thing that moves us out of the academic and the theoretical, the space that policymakers sometimes occupy, to the reality of people's lives. And the more that they see these aren't just numbers, these are people's lives, and the decisions you make can have an impact, I think the more that we collectively can hold weight to sort of shift them. So I'm the optimist. I will take them at their word, but we need to do a lot of holding a mirror up against them.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Miata. That was quite a fulsome response. Ben, Cassie, Debbie, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, if I would like to come in actually, because I mean, I do think that they, I agree with Miata, they are being incredibly short-sighted. And I think one of the things that we noticed during the lockdown was that for the very first time, we saw a rise in the number of children who were being admitted to hospital because of malnutrition. And holiday hunger is a real and tangible issue which impacts upon families on low incomes. And it affects the ability of children to enjoy their holidays in the same way as others. And it places incredible pressure financially, but also in terms of stress and mental health on those parents who are seeking to try to properly feed their children. And so I think the arguments that were used certainly yesterday by government in rejecting the motion were quite harsh, actually. Nationalising children, I think, was one of the phrases that we used, which I think is really problematic. And so I think that we collectively need to up our game with regards to advocacy. There is a lot of data that we can use at our disposal to say that the response that government needs to make in relation to this issue in particular needs to follow the evidence, and the evidence is clear, and also recognising that there are lots and lots of small third sector organisations that do provide a lot of holiday support for children in the holidays, providing them with a meal, but also with activities and things to do during the holidays. But these are organisations that need to be financially supported, and it's very difficult for them to continue to do this if we have a pandemic happening at the same time. So I agree with the advocacy point. I think evidence is on our side, and the government are just wrong on this, and they need to be told that, quite frankly.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Miata. I'm going to move us on to the next question, a slightly more practical question here, but nonetheless extremely important. And Cassie, if I might ask this of you, because you actually talked quite comprehensively about some of the issues that we're facing on digital. So the question is, one of the things we are learning is that as funders too, we are not all digitally upskilled and do not all understand the potential of technology. We're not producers, but consumers of that technology. So how can we address this gap in our thinking and practice, obviously collaboratively, in order to better support civil society organisations?
I wish I had a simple answer to that. I feel like that's been my work for quite a long time. You know, I think some of it does need to come from, I think Kamna's absolutely right that a lot of funders themselves definitely do not understand technology. And so it needs to start with us and being curious and honest about like where our levels of understanding are. And I think those of us that have more understanding and expertise you know, need to do a better job of kind of being very clear what we mean by different things as well. So when we ran, you know, when we had the first round of the digital fund at the National Lottery Community Fund, and we had 1,200 applications, we had this like sector view, if you like, of how civil society organizations were interpreting the word digital and what they needed and what they meant. And it was extraordinarily different, probably unsurprisingly. But yeah, I have been surprised at how little the sector has moved forward really around digital. Do I have the answers? I mean, I think Jamie's on this from the Co-op Foundation, the chair of the Co-op Foundation. Like, we are doing a piece of work called the Community Tech Fellowship, the Co-op Foundation. I think like new initiatives like that are really trying to build policy type understanding in community leadership rather than skills. So I think I sort of mentioned that in my talk, but I think we get very stuck in the sector on skills and inclusion and access, and those are really important, but they are like first, that they're like the very literal and obvious things, and it's the second order and third order consequences. It's the sort of long-term impacts of the power of big tech, and I just feel like in the years that I've been working in this space, I haven't really felt any curiosity or demand from other funders or civil society to want to engage more in that conversation. So yeah, I don't have the answer, but it is something, you know, like when we talk about climate crisis and everything we've got coming towards us with that, and that some people are already living in, the power of big tech is as concerning. It should be as concerning. Those two things, climate and big tech, are the two things that will determine our future.
Thank you very much, Cassie. I think particularly with respect to not necessarily having the answer, I'm very clear that this week's conference has actually been about getting into the devil in the detail in some of the questions that we need to ask, and actually taking forward, developing those answers together. And certainly some of those comments that you made about digital, I think I've heard many other people make as well. Very interesting, thank you. So moving on to our next question. So another question that many of our delegates have asked is, changing the way we do things can seem an often repeated empty phrase. How best can we share existing models of good practice, the delivery of services and activities that are affecting change? Ben, could I come to you on that first? Particularly as you're reflecting on the 30 years worth of change coming up.
Yeah, I mean, it's not my area of expertise. I mean, I actually think, you know, London is quite lucky in having infrastructure, third sector infrastructure organisations like, well, sort of City Bridge Trust, Trust for London, and then organisations like London Funders and London Plus that do quite a lot of pooling, sharing. I mean, I'd be just reflecting on sort of civil society in London more generally, and sort of what is the sort of story of the last 10 or 20 years. I suppose what I'm struck by is I'm a huge fan of the mayor. Of the mayoralty. Very wide about what's going on in terms of the sort of the what government's doing. But I don't think that certainly the first two mayors were particularly interested in civil society, didn't really invest heavily in it. There was probably much more engagement with sort of business groups than there were with civil society groups. And I think that's changed a bit with Sadiq, but I still don't think that sort of when we look back at 20 years of the mayoralty, sort of one of the big stories in London will be about the way in which government worked really creatively with civil society. I just don't think we've seen that. I think there probably are other cities that have just been a bit more radical in terms of empowerment, whether it's Seoul in Korea, or even, some of the things that Anne Hidalgo has done in Paris in terms of sort of citizen budgets and really allowing sort of civil society to sort of get engaged in the policy making process. If I could just sort of say one more thing, which takes us back to that's the first question, which is I just think as a country, we're just at a really, really interesting juncture in regards to devolution and decentralization. And I think issues of citizenship and civil society are very closely connected. So, the story of the last 10 years, particularly on austerity, actually there's been lots of talk about devolution, particularly Northern Powerhouse, but actually what's really gone on is a huge amount of centralization. And you can just look at what's gone on in terms of public sector employment. And there's been massive increase in public sector employment in central government and a huge decline in local government and regional government. And I think all the instincts of the current government in regards to the response to the COVID have been the centralizing ones. And that's not surprising. Wars do lead to centralization. One of the reasons we have such a centralized system of government in this country is because it's a legacy of the Second World War. But it does feel as if in some ways that model is being tested to destruction to me. And, it's clearly, we've really struggled to roll out things like test and trace, just because we've done it centrally, completely, unconnected to, or largely unconnected to local government. And then you've got this really interesting phenomenon of the mayors, the metro mayors, as well as the mayor of London, who though they're not well funded and don't have much power relative to mayors elsewhere, have got this incredible popular mandate. And they're really, really using that. You can see that with Andy Burnham in Manchester, and Sadiq's got it here as well in spades. And government might have sort of created something the power of which it doesn't quite understand. So I think we are at this sort of really interesting junction. It will be interesting to see what happens, because, to me, the future of civil society in London, in Britain, has got to be about having much more government, much closer to people, and that includes city and local government.
Thank you, Ben. That was a good, broader, more strategic take on that question. You made some interesting comments there. Thank you very much. Panelists and delegates, I'm very conscious of time and the fact that James is about to fire me as chair. So I'm going to take chair's privilege and go for a final question. I'm reflecting on the fact that all of our panelists spoke about some of the issues that we're dealing with respect to inequalities. So the question that a number of our delegates have asked is prefaced with some awareness that almost 50% of London Community Response Wave 3 grants went to BAME-led organisations. What more could funders do together? This includes non-financial support to tackle structural inequalities. If I could ask Debbie to come in on that first, and I will invite all other panelists to come in on that one as well. Thank you.
That's a really good question, and I've not had a chance to properly think about it because I want to give a really good answer. So I think that the fact that half of funding has gone to BAME-led organisations is a huge success story. I think that there are other ways in which we've tried to support the sector. We've supported infrastructure organisations, recognising that many of those organisations who might have applied or might have not been able to apply are very small and need additional forms of support. And so we need to better prop up some of our infrastructure organisations to enable them to reach out and support those smaller grassroots organisations. And I think that that's definitely something that funders can support. It's recognising that we do need to build capacity in that part of the sector, because these are organisations which will do the work, but will often do so without being properly resourced, and do so often at great cost to themselves. And so infrastructure is definitely one route in which to do that. I think the collaborative model has been incredibly successful during this pandemic, and it's one which I would definitely recommend we continue to develop as we go forward. I think I kind of mentioned in my opening remarks that I think the recession itself is going to have a huge impact on the abilities of regional and local government to provide support to the VCS sector. And we need to make sure that as different levels of government, we're working as closely as possible with funders like yourselves, like all of those on the call, like with London Funders, to enable us to bring to those smaller organisations the support that they need to boost themselves, to be able to make better funding applications where necessary, but also to provide some of that unrestricted funding that we know is going to be really necessary as we try to come out of this pandemic.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Cassie, as a funder, any brief reflections from yourself on that question?
I've been really cheekily asking a couple of my funding colleagues over in our Teams chat, Helen, what shall I say? So yeah, I mean, one of the things I didn't get to in my talk was about the kind of how we work better as an ecosystem, how we understand our different roles. And I think we all need to, I mean, London Funders is a really good example of how funders have collaborated, but I guess across the country, you know, in our different regional funding teams, you know, growing that commitment to collaborate and work out who's best placed to do what, I think it is really important part of that. And I think we've been able to demonstrate we've been doing that through this crisis. So it's how we continue that. And I would just add as well, so thank you, Helen. I would just add as well that an important part of that, you know, if how we fund in crisis,
I think we may have lost Cassie. So Miata, if I can just briefly come to you, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, and I would give this answer because I'm from the New Economics Foundation, but I think you fund getting to the root cause. So if you think about a lot of the funding, and it's necessary because there is a lot of mitigating the symptoms of a system that's broken, but a lot of funding goes towards mitigating the symptoms rather than trying to kind of fund the root cause. Yeah. And, you know, our view is that in the end, inequality is a function of the economic system that we have that doesn't work for people and doesn't work for planet. And the thing that you need to change in order to get to the root cause of inequality is to change the system. And there are lots of organizations that are trying to do that, organizations at the grassroots that are trying to think about different ways of doing things, as well as organizations trying to change at the national, regional, local level. And we need to put more, you know, power to their elbow. So I think there's a really important role for funders. Yes, some of this will come about by national change, but there's really important work that can be done in places whereby funders, you know, in partnership with grassroots organizations, VCS, civil society, sit alongside local authorities and institutions and say, what sort of place do we want? How do we bring the different partners around the table? If we are tracking improvements in living standards, reduction in inequality as a key metric of success, what does that mean for interventions we need to put in place? What do the different partners need to do? And there's a really powerful voice for people who are living and breathing the worst side of this to be part of that conversation. So fund the root cause, fund the organizations that are trying to change the system, as well as trying to help those that are trying to alleviate the system.
Thank you so much, Miata. Ben, I don't know if there's anything you particularly wanted to add to that. Okay. Again, being conscious of time, I know there are plenty of other questions in the Q&A, but I know the team at London Funders will pick that up. Can I just thank from the bottom of my heart our panelists who've really given us some amazing things to think about and reflect on, and certainly will help us really move forward in terms of how we genuinely not just recover from this crisis, but truly renew London and make sure it does ultimately become the city for all, the city that we actually want to live in. Thank you so much, everyone, and I'm going to hand back to James.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Yolande, and thank you also to Debbie, Mayetta, Ben and Cassie for closing our conference today with such powerful contributions. There's some real challenges there for us to reflect on, alongside some inspiration and some ambition for the potential of London and our communities. I think alongside the contributions we've had over the last couple of days from speakers who've spoken about the past and the present of funding, I think you'll agree that despite the uncertainty, that's given us a really clear framework to help shape our thinking about where we go next, both in terms of things like the London Community Response, but also about our work as a funding community for the long term of London. So to round off today, we've got one of our famous polls that we're going to launch for you that will just ask you to try and tell us a few thoughts that will help shape our response as an organisation, as a network, as we go forward. So the poll should be on your screen now. You'll see that there are a couple of questions at the beginning that asks you to tell us what's on your mind at the end of this session. So firstly, what challenge first comes to your thoughts about the future, be that about practical things, about the availability of funds or the pressures that civil society is going to be under in the coming months and years, whether it's about bigger topics around injustice, uncertainty, the politics, climate, some of the issues that have come out through the contributions from our panelists. The second question there tries to balance that out by asking you what excites you about the future for our communities. We've heard there about the potential of things like digital or working more locally, or the opportunity to work in partnership to bring about fairness and equity for our communities as well. Our next couple of questions will then ask you more personally how you think you'll be working. It's really important for us to try and think about how we can work together as a sector, but to do so, it's good to think about how you'll be working through these times as well. So trying to project 5 years ahead, there's two questions there that asks you, firstly, where you think you'll be working in 5 years' time, whether you think you'll be based in an office, whether you think you'll be based virtually, whether you think you'll be hot desking and using shared spaces alongside other organisations and people. And then there's a question about how you'll be working in terms of your hours. Do you think, like Dolly Parton, you'll be working 9 to 5? What a way to make a living. Do you think you'll be working compressed hours? Do you think you'll be doing longer days but working less of them? Or do you think you'll be working flexibly, perhaps working earlier or later at weekends as we have been doing through this crisis, but taking those practices and balancing it slightly better with other activities you have in your life to get the job done? And then finally, you've got question 5 there on the poll as well, which is asking you what can London Funders do to ensure we're working well with you? Some of that's about our events. So could we continue doing these digital events that bring you together in virtual spaces to connect and learn together? Is it about how we run the timings of our events? Are you an early person or a late person who'd like us to do more early morning, late evening things, giving you time during the day to get out there and enjoy some sunshine during the winter months? Is it actually about how we connect you in a physical sense and a virtual sense as well? So could we be creating spaces for you to work together with other people, either in the real world when we're allowed to do that, or virtually so that you can connect in different ways? Is it about how we inform your work? Is it about how we inform others through contributing to the policy debate? And is it about continuing to lead some of the collaborations that we've seen over the crisis period through to the long term? Be that the kind of things that we've seen through the We Stand With the Sector statement, through to the more practical collaborations that we've had around the London Community Response. So a few questions there for you to dwell on that will help us shape both a programme of events or thoughts from us in terms of what we do in terms of the priorities that you feel there are as a community, also about how you're going to work, and then about how we can support you best to do that. So we're just going to give you another 10 seconds to vote on that, and then I'll be sharing the results back with you. But importantly, we'll also be using them at London Funders to help shape what we do over the coming months to support you, but also as we look ahead to our renewed strategy to make sure we're as effective as we can be at supporting the funding community in London so that Londoners can live better lives as a result of the work that we do together. So I'll close that polling. Thank you for your votes. I'll share the results on the screens there. So the first challenge on your mind by a slim margin there is pressure. So the increased demand for services beyond the capacity of civil society, and some real work for us to do to think that through, but doing that in a way that's fair. So injustice there coming out very close second in terms of the challenge that's on your mind. that opportunity to work in partnership more coming out there as the thing that most excites you for the future. We've seen that in terms of partnership between funders, but also better and stronger relationships between civil society groups and between funders and those groups themselves, that together we can achieve the change that we want to see. In terms of where you're going to be in 5 years' time, you think you're going to mostly be in a mix of half the time in your office, half the time at home. That of course has implications for how we work as a network and how we work with you, so that's really interesting to hear. Not many Dolly Parton fans amongst you, only 7% there wanting to work 9 to 5, most of you wanting to think about how you work flexibly. And again, we'll try to reflect that in the events and programs that we put on to accommodate the different working patterns and different working practices that you're going to have in the future. And then that really important point there, you'd really like us to continue these digital and online spaces so you can have these discussions in the future. We've certainly seen the power of bringing you all together through the conference over the last 3 days. We've heard loud and clear from you how important it is that you have these opportunities to reflect and learn together. And we'll be looking at continuing to build that into our programme for the future. So for now, I think I just want to thank you all for joining us today and over the last 2 days for the conference. We'd encourage you to continue the conversation online using that hashtag conference20. You may have seen over the last few days some of our speakers drinking from these amazing limited edition London Funders mugs. We're going to be looking closely at Twitter over the next 24 hours and looking for who uses Conference20 in the most exciting and innovative way in your tweets. And you too could get a mug like the one that Cassie is modelling for you there. And Yolande, everyone's got these mugs, but they are limited edition, I tell you. So whoever uses Conference20 in the best way on a tweet will be sending you one of these mugs in the post, so you too can be drinking from a London Funders mug. For now, thank you for all of you for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. Do check out on Twitter for more content coming your way. Look on our YouTube channel where we're posting recordings of all 3 days of the conference so you can share those with colleagues. Thank you to our panel in particular for today. Thank you to Yolande, Debbie, Mayata, Ben and Cassie. It's been a fantastic 3 days. It's been great to bring you all together to think about the future of funding in London, and we look forward to working with you to build on those ideas and shape a fairer future for our communities. Thank you all for joining us. Bye for now.